This video is going to show how to make a really efficient CO2 reactor. This is my tank. It's a 29-gallon planted tank. I'm in the process of redoing the whole thing, and I have some other videos showing some details on that. But for this video, we're just going to cover the homemade reactor. As you can see right now, I just have a bubble ladder, which I've kind of heard doesn't always work that well as far as dissolving your CO2 efficiently into your aquarium. Right now for my CO2, it's all just homemade DIY. There's a ton of instructions out there on how to make it. It's super easy, so I'm not going to cover that in this video. The posts that I read online discussed using this Elite mini filter. It's Elite, I think that's made by the company Hagen, which has a lot of aquarium stuff. I think this is available at Petco. It's on their website. I couldn't find it in any stores, but it's about $10. I actually bought mine off of Amazon. It's basically just a really cheap, very tiny, small little filter meant for tiny aquariums. And we're going to make some changes to it to turn it into a CO2 reactor. So everything you come in the box, or everything that comes in the box here, you just get a little manual, the filter itself, a little tube in here, which we don't really need. So we're going to start by modifying the filter itself. Alright, now I don't have a tripod, so I'm going to try to do this one-handed. So the first thing you're going to want to do is take the filter and pop the top off, and inside the bottom you'll see that there's a sponge. So we'll go ahead and take the sponge out. We are going to need that later, so we'll set it aside. The next thing that we're going to do is there's a little green flow switch on the bottom of this. You move it from side to side, and I guess it's supposed to adjust the flow of the filter. If you carefully kind of grab underneath where this little tab is, you can pop the thing off, and that's what we want to do because we don't need that anymore. The next thing we're going to do is, if you notice, and we put this bottom part back onto the filter, there's now a tiny little space right here where that green tab used to go. Now the instruction that I read online basically says to put your CO2 tube in right through that hole, but if we do it that way, it kind of pinches down on the tubing, and I'm kind of worried that that might restrict the airflow. So what I'm going to do is actually use a drill to drill out a little bit of more space in this plastic casing to allow my CO2 tubing to go through without worrying about the pinching of the tube. Alright, so now the hole is finished being drilled, and you can see that the CO2 tubing fits really nicely right into the side of that filter. Now basically the way this is supposed to work is that there's just enough of this tubing in there so that when the bubble comes out of the tubing, it gets sucked up right in here into the bottom of the motor where that impeller blade is, and the impeller motor breaks the big CO2 bubbles into a lot of tiny bubbles, and it'll spit them then out of the front. Okay, so there's one other little thing we're going to do. Remember, this is the directional flow that kind of directs the water out of the filter, and we have to attach the sponge to this to help make the CO2 bubbles even smaller. And it has this little peg for attaching another airline hose to it. We don't need that, and it's going to make it even harder to attach the filter, or the sponge to this with that peg in place. But it's pretty easy to take out, remove it like that, and now we should be able to stretch the sponge over it, just like that. Alright, so I'm going to try to do a before and after. This is my CO2 setup right now with the CO2 tubing coming right down into the tank, going up the bubble ladder. I'm probably averaging maybe only a bubble every second or so with my DIY setup with the 2-liter Coke bottle and the sugar and the yeast and water mixture. So this is what it's like before, and this is what it's like now. I took the bubble ladder out, and you probably can't even, you can barely see the size of the bubbles spurting out there. My tank got a little dirty when I was moving things around, so that's what some of the debris floating around is. And I'm not sure if the video is picking up on the sound, but the only real disadvantage to having this kind of a diffuser is that since you are having that filter run, it does make a pretty constant burping noise every time it gets a bubble. But if you can see those bubbles, they're coming out really, really small, which is the whole point of doing this in the first place. Plus, a lot of the bubbles, I guess another advantage, a lot of the bubbles are getting stuck to the filter itself, which means they're going to be trapped inside the aquarium even longer. So for $10, I think this is going to be a really good way to diffuse my CO2. I may play around with having it on a timer so it doesn't run at night, but maybe I'll post a little bit more on that later. So that's it, $10, use this mini filter. So far it seems to be working pretty well. Plants look good. I'm happy.